face just started leaking. Alright, so I finished the service, gave the final blessing, and went straight to the sacristy. That Sunday, there would be no mingling with the faithful, no pointless conversations. That Sunday, I was faced by a philosophical dilemma. I had to choose to respect the institution rather than the words on which that institution was based. I'm getting old now, and God could take me at any moment, and I've remained faithful to my religion, and I believe that for all its errors, it really is trying to put things right. This will take decades, possibly centuries, but one day all that will matter is love, and Christ's words, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I've devoted my entire life to the priesthood, and I don't regret my decision for 1 second. However, there are times like that Sunday when, although I didn't doubt my faith, I did doubt men. I know now what happened to Athena, and I wonder, did it all start there, or was it already in her soul? I think of the many Athenas and Lucases in the world who are divorced, and because of that can no longer receive the sacrament of the Eucharist. All they can do is contemplate the suffering, crucified Christ, and listen to his words, the words that are not always in accord with the laws of the Vatican. In a few cases, these people leave the church, but the majority continue coming to Mass on Sundays because that's what they're used to, even though they know the miracle of the transmutation of the bread and wine into flesh and blood of the Lord is forbidden to them. I like to imagine that when she left, Athena met Jesus weeping and confused. She would have thrown herself into his arms, asking him to explain why she was being excluded just because of a piece of paper she'd signed, something of no importance on the spiritual plane, and which was of interest only to the registry offices and taxman. Looking at Athena, Jesus might have replied, "My child, I've been excluded too, and it's a very long time since they've allowed me in there." Facts. Just saying. I'm sorry. I need to stop cutting onions this early in the morning. Alright, let's get on with it. So I can further my humiliation by crying on a camera. This book, I just didn't expect it to be so heavy. Oh no, I didn't expect that. Okay. Pavel Podbielski, 57, owner of the apartment. Athena and I had one thing in common. We were both refugees from a war and arrived in England when we were still children. Although I fled Poland over 50 years ago, we both knew that despite the physical change, our traditions continue to exist in exile. Communities join together again, language and religion remain alive, and in a place that will always be foreign to them. People tend to look after one another. Traditions continue, but the desire to go back gradually disappears. The desire needs to stay alive in our heart as a hope with which we like to delude ourselves. But it will never be put into practice. I will never go back to live in Częstochowa. Częstochowa. And Athena, I know I'm saying that. Częstochowa. Is that right? I'm saying it wrong. Częstochowa. 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 I think that's it. And Athena and her family will never return to Beirut. It was this kind of solidarity that made me rent her the third floor of my house in Bassett Road. Normally I'd prefer tenants without children, and I'd made that mistake before. Two things had happened. I complained about the noise they made during the day, and they complained about the noise I made during the night. Both noises had their roots in sacred elements, crying, and music, but they belonged to two completely different worlds, and it was hard for them to coexist. I warned her, but she didn't really take it in and told me not to worry about her son. He spent all day at his grandmother's house anyway, and the apartment was conveniently close to her work at a local bank. Despite my warnings and despite holding out bravely at first, 8 days later, the doorbell rang. It was Athena, with her child in her arms. My son can't sleep. Could you turn down the music? At least for one night. Everyone in the room stared at her. What's going on? The child immediately stopped crying as if he were surprised, or as if he were as surprised as his mother to see that group of people who had stopped in mid-dance. I pressed the pause button on the cassette player and beckoned her in. Then I restarted the music so as not to interrupt the ritual. Athena sat down in one corner of the room, rocking her child in her arms and watching him drift off to sleep. Despite the noise of the drums and the brass, she stayed for a whole ceremony and left along with the other guests. But as I thought she would, she rang my doorbell the next morning before going to work. You don't have to explain what I saw. People dancing with their eyes closed, because I know what that means. I often do the same thing myself. And at the moment, those are the only times of peace and serenity in my life. Before I became a mother, I used to go to clubs with my husband and my friends, and I'd see people dancing with their eyes closed there too. Some were just trying to look cool, and others seemed to be genuinely moved by a greater, more powerful force. And ever since I've been old enough to think for myself, I've always used dance as a way of getting in touch with something stronger and more powerful than myself. Anyway, could you tell me what the music was? What are you doing this Sunday? Nothing special. I might go for a walk with Bioral in Regent's Park and get some fresh air. I'll have plenty of time later on for a social calendar of my own. For the moment, I've decided to follow my son's. I'll come with you if you like. On the 2 nights before our walk, Athena came to watch the ritual. Her son fell asleep after only a few minutes, and she merely watched what was going on around her without saying a word. She sat quite still on the sofa, but I was sure that her soul was dancing. On Sunday afternoon, while we were walking in the park, I asked her to pay attention to everything she was seeing and hearing. The leaves moving in the breeze, the waves on the lake, the birds singing, the dogs barking, the shouts of children as they ran back and forth as if obeying some strange logic incomprehensible to grown-ups. Everything moves, and everything moves to a rhythm, and everything that moves to a rhythm creates a sound. At this moment, the same thing is happening here and everywhere else in the world. Our ancestors noticed the same thing when they tried to escape from the cold into caves. Things moved and made noise. The first human beings may have been frightened by this at first, but that fear was soon replaced by a sense of awe, and they understood that this was the way in which some superior being was communicating with them. In the hope of reciprocating that communication, they started imitating the sounds and movements around them, and thus dance and music were born. A few days ago, you told me that dance puts you in touch with something stronger than yourself. Yes, when I dance, I'm a free woman, or rather a free spirit who can travel through the universe, contemplate the present, divine the future, and be transformed into pure energy. And that gives me enormous pleasure, a joy that always goes far beyond everything I've experienced or will experience in my lifetime. There was a time when I was determined to become a saint, praising God through music and movement, but that path was closed to me forever now. Which path do you mean? She made her son more comfortable in his stroller. I saw that she didn't want to answer that question, so I asked again. When mouths close, it's because there's something important to be said. Without a flicker of emotions, as if she'd always had to endure in silence the things life imposed on her, she told me about what had happened at the church, and the priest, possibly her only friend, had refused her communion. She also told me about the curse she had uttered them, and that she had left the Catholic Church forever. A saint is someone who lives his or her life with dignity, I explained. All we have to do is understand that we're all here for a reason and commit ourselves to that. Then we can laugh at our sufferings, large and small, and walk fearlessly, aware that each step has meaning. We can let ourselves be guided by the light emanating from the vertex. What do you mean, the vertex? In mathematics, it's the topmost angle of the triangle. In life, too, it's the culminating point, the goal of all those who, like everyone else, makes mistakes, but who, even in their darkest moments, never lose sight of the light emanating from their hearts. That's what we're trying to do in our group. The vertex is hidden inside us, and we can reach it if we accept it and recognize its light. I explained that I'd come up with the name, The Search for the Vertex, for the dance. She'd watched on previous nights, performed by people of all ages. At the time, there were 10 of us, aged between 19 and 65. Athena asked where I'd found out about it, and I told her immediately that after World War II, some of the family had managed to escape from the communist regime that was taking over Poland, and decided to move to England. They'd been advised to bring with them art objects and antiquarian books, which they were told were highly valued in this part of the world. Paintings and sculptures were quickly sold, but the books remained gathering dust. My mother was keen for me to read and speak Polish, and the books formed part of my education. One day, inside a 19th century edition of Thomas Malthus, I found 2 pages of notes written by my grandfather, who had died in a concentration camp. I started reading, assuming it would be something to do with an inheritance, or else a passionate letter intended for a secret lover, because it was said that he'd fallen in love with someone in Russia. There was, in fact, some truth in this. The pages contained a description of his journey to Siberia during the Communist Revolution. There in the remote village of Dietov, he fell in love with an actress. Editor's note: it has not been possible to locate this village on the map. The name may have been deliberately changed, or the place itself may have been disappeared after Stalin's forced migrations. According to my grandfather, the actress was part of a sect that believed they had found the remedy for all ills through a particular kind of dance, because a dance brought the dancer into contact with the light from the vertex. They feared that the tradition would disappear. The inhabitants of the village were certain to be transported to another place, but the actress and her friends begged him to write down what they had learned. He did, but clearly didn't think it was of much importance, because he left his notes inside a book, and there they remained until the day I found them. Athena broke in. But dance isn't something you write about, you have to do it. Exactly. All the notes say is this: dance to the point of exhaustion, as if you were a mountaineer climbing a mountain, a sacred mountain. Dance until you are so out of breath that your organism is forced to obtain oxygen some other way. And it is that, in the end, that will cause you to lose your identity and your relationship with space and time. Dance only to the sound of percussion. Beat the process every day. Know that at a certain moment your eyes will quite naturally close, and you will begin to see a light that comes from within, a light that answers your questions and develops your hidden powers. Have you developed some special power? Instead of replying, I suggested that she join our group, since her son seemed perfectly at ease in the room with the dancers, even when the noise of the cymbals and the other percussion instruments was at its loudest. The following day, At the usual time, she was there for the start of the session. I introduced her to my friends, explaining that she was my upstairs neighbor. No one said anything about their lives or asked her what she did. When the moment came, I turned on the music and we began to dance. She started dancing with the child in her arms, but he soon fell asleep and she put him down on the sofa. Before I closed my eyes and went into a trance, I saw that she had understood exactly what I meant by the path of the vertex. Every day except Sunday she was there with the child. We would exchange a few words of welcome, and then I would put on the music a friend of mine had brought from the Russian steppes, and we would all dance to the point of exhaustion. After a month of this, she asked me for a copy of the tape. I'd like to do the dancing in the morning before I leave Bioral at my mom's house to go to work. I tried to dissuade her. I don't know, I think a group that's connected by the same energy creates a kind of aura that helps everyone get into the trance state. Besides, doing the dancing before you go to work is just asking to get the sack because you'll be exhausted all day. Athena thought for a moment, then said, "You're absolutely right. When you talk about the collective energy, in your group, for example, there are 4 couples and your wife. All of them have found love. That's why they can share such a positive vibration with me. But I'm on my own, or rather I'm with my son, and he can't yet manifest his love in a way we can understand, so I'd prefer to accept my loneliness. If I try to run away from it now, I'll never find a partner again. If I accept it rather than fight against it, things might change. I've noticed that loneliness gets stronger when we try to face it down, but gets weaker when we simply ignore it. Did you join our group in search of love? That would be a perfectly good reason, I think, but the answer is no. I came in search of a meaning for my life, because at present its only meaning is my son, Bioral, and I'm afraid I might end up destroying him, either by being overprotective or by projecting onto him the dreams I've never managed to realize. Then one night, while I was dancing, I felt that I'd been cured, as if we were talking about some physical ailment. We'd probably call it a miracle, but it was a spiritual malaise that was making me unhappy, and it suddenly vanished. I knew what she meant. No one taught me to dance to the sound of that music, Athena went on, but I have a feeling I know what I'm doing. It's not something you have to learn. Remember our walks in the parks and what we saw there, nature creating its own rhythm and adapting itself to each moment. No one taught me how to love either. But I loved God, I loved my husband, I loved my son, and my family, and yet there's still something missing. Although I get tired when I'm dancing, when I stop, I seem to be in a state of grace, of profound ecstasy. I want that ecstasy to last throughout the day, and for it to help me find what I lack, the love of a man. I can see the heart of a man while I'm dancing, but not his face. I sense that he's close by, which is why I need to remain alert. I need to dance in the morning so I can spend the rest of the day paying attention to everything that's going around me. Do you know what the word ecstasy means? It comes from the Greek, and it means to stand outside yourself. Spending the whole day outside yourself is asking too much of the body and the soul. I'd like to try it anyway. I saw that there was no point arguing, so I made her a copy of the tape, and from then on I awoke every morning to the sound of music and dancing upstairs. And I wondered how she would face her work at the bank after almost an hour of being in a trance. When we bumped into each other in the corridor, I suggested she come in for coffee, and she told me that she'd made more copies of the tape, and that many of her colleagues at work were also now looking for the vertex. Did I do wrong? Was it a secret? Of course it wasn't. On the contrary, she was helping me preserve a tradition that was almost lost. According to my grandfather's notes, one of the women said that a monk who visited the region had once told them that each of us contains our ancestors and all the generations to come. When we free ourselves, we are freeing all humanity. So all the men and women in that village in Siberia must be here now, and very happy too. Their work is being reborn in this world thanks to your grandfather. There's one thing I'd like to ask you. What made you decide to dance after you read those notes? If you'd read something about sports instead, would you have decided to become a footballer? A footballer. This was a question no one had ever asked me. Because at the time I was ill. I was suffering from a rare form of arthritis, and the doctors told me I should prepare myself for life in a wheelchair. By the age of 35, I saw that I didn't have much time ahead of me, so I decided to devote my life to something I wouldn't be able to do later on. My grandfather had written on one of those small sheets of paper that the inhabitants of Diedup believed in the curative powers of trances, and it seemed that they were right. I didn't say anything, but I wasn't so sure. Perhaps the doctors were wrong. Perhaps the fact of being from an immigrant family, unable to allow myself the luxury of being ill, acted with such force upon my unconscious mind that it provoked a natural reaction in my body. Or perhaps it really was a miracle, although that went totally against what my Catholic faith preaches. Dance is not a cure. I remember that as an adolescent, I had no idea what the right music would sound like, so I used to put on a black hood and imagine everything around me had ceased to exist, and my spirit would travel to Diedup to be with those men and women, with my grandfather and his beloved actress. In the silence of my bedroom, I would ask them to teach me to dance, to go beyond my limits, because soon I would be paralyzed forever. The more my body moved, the more brightly the light in my heart shone. And the more I learned, perhaps on my own, perhaps from the ghost of the past. I even imagined the music they must have listened to during the rituals, and when a friend visited Siberia many years later, I asked him to bring me back some records. To my surprise, one of them was very similar to the music I had imagined would accompany the dancing in Diedup. It was the best to say nothing of all this to Athena. She was easily influenced, and I thought slightly unstable. Perhaps what you're doing is right, was all I said. We talked again shortly before her trip to the Middle East. She seemed contented, as if she'd found everything she wanted. Love. My colleagues at work had formed a group. They call themselves the Pilgrims of the Vertex, and all thanks to your grandfather. All thanks to you, you mean, because you felt the need to share the dance with others. I know you're leaving, but I'd like to thank you for giving another dimension to what I've been doing all these years and trying to spread the light to a few interested people. But always very tentatively, always afraid. People might find the whole story ridiculous. Do you know what I've learned? That although ecstasy is the ability to stand outside yourself, dance is a way of rising up into space, of discovering new dimensions while still remaining in touch with your body. When you dance, the spiritual world and the real world manage to coexist quite happily. I think classical ballet dancers dance on point because they're simultaneously touching the earth and reaching up into the skies. As far as I can remember, those were her last words to me. During any dance to which we surrender with joy, the brain loses its controlling power, and the heart takes up the reins of the body. Only at that moment does the vertex appear, as long as we believe in it, of course. Peter Sherney, 47, manager of a branch of name of bank omitted, in Holland Park, London. I only took on Athena because her family was one of our most important customers. After all, the world revolves around mutual interests. She seemed a very restless person, so I gave her a dull clerical post, hoping that she would soon resign. That way I could tell her father that I'd done my best to help her, but without success. My experience as a manager had taught me to recognize people's states of mind, even if they said nothing. In a management course I attended, we learned that if you wanted to get rid of someone, you should do everything you can to provoke them into rudeness, so that you can have a perfectly good reason to dismiss them. I don't even think you need a class to learn that. Why relationships these days don't work. I did everything I could to achieve my objective with Athena. She didn't depend on her salary to live and would soon learn how pointless it was. Having to get up early, drop her son off at her mother's house, slave away all day at a repetitive job, pick her son up again, go to the supermarket, spend time with her son before putting him to bed, and then the next day spend another 3 hours on public transport, and all for no reason, when there were so many other more interesting ways of filling her days. She grew increasingly irritable, and I felt proud of my strategy. I would get what I wanted. She started complaining about the apartment where she lived, saying that her landlord kept her awake all night, playing really loud music. And then suddenly something changed. At first, it was only Athena, but soon it was a whole branch. How did I notice this change? Well, a group of workers is like a kind of orchestra. A good manager is a conductor. He knows who is out of tune, who is playing with real commitment, who is simply following the crowd. Athena seemed to be playing her instrument without the least enthusiasm. She seemed distant, never sharing the joys and sadness of her personal life with her colleagues, letting it be known that when she left work, her free time was entirely taken up with looking after her son. Then suddenly she became more relaxed, more communicative, telling anyone who would listen that she had discovered the secret of rejuvenation. Rejuvenation, of course, is a magic word coming from someone who is barely 21. Sounded pretty ridiculous. And yet, other members of the staff believed her and started to ask her for the secret formula. Efficiency increased. Even though her workload had remained unchanged. Her colleagues, who up until then had never exchanged more than a good morning or a good night with her, started asking her out to lunch. When they came back, they seemed very pleased, and the department's productivity made a giant leap. And I know that people who are in love do affect the environment in which they live, and so I immediately assumed that Athena must have met somebody very important in her life, and she did, but in a different way. I asked, and she agreed, adding that she'd never before gone out with a customer, but that in this case she'd been unable to refuse. Normally, this would have been grounds for immediate dismissal. The bank's rules are clear. Personal contact with customers is forbidden. But by then I was aware that her behavior had infected almost everyone else. Some of her colleagues started getting together with her after work, and a few of them had, I believe, been to her house. I had a very dangerous situation on my hands. The young trainee with no previous work experience, who up until then had seemed to veer between shyness and aggression, had become a kind of natural leader among my workers. If I fired her, they would think it was out of jealousy, and I'd lose their respect. If I kept her on, I ran the risk, within a matter of months, of losing control of the group. I decided to wait a little. But meanwhile, there was a definitive increase in the energy at the bank. I hate the word energy because it doesn't really mean anything unless you're talking about electricity. Highly disagree. Anyway, our customers seemed much happier and were starting to recommend other people to come to us. The employees seemed happy too, and even though their workload had doubled, I didn't need to take on any more staff because they were all coping fine. One day I received a letter from my superiors They wanted me to go to Barcelona for a group meeting so that I could explain my management techniques to them. According to them, I had increased profit without increasing expenditure. And that, of course, is the only thing that interests executives everywhere. But what techniques? At least I knew where it had all started, so I summoned Athena to my office. I complimented her on her excellent productivity skills, and she thanked me with a smile. I proceeded cautiously, not wishing to be misinterpreted. And how's your boyfriend? I've always found that anyone who is loved has more love to give. What does he do? He works for Scotland Yard. Editor's note. Police investigation linked to London's Metropolitan Police. I preferred not to ask any further questions, but I needed to keep the conversation going, and I didn't have much time. I've noticed a great change in you, and have you noticed a change in the bank too? How to respond to a question like that? On the one hand, I would be giving her more power than was advisable, but on the other, if I wasn't straight with her, I'd never get the answers I needed. Yes, I've noticed a big change, and I'm thinking of promoting you. I need to travel. I'd like to get out of London and discover new horizons. Travel? Just when everything was going so well in my branch, you wanted to leave? Although, when I thought about it, wasn't that precisely the way out I needed and wanted? I can help the bank if you give me more responsibility, she went on. Yes, she was giving me an excellent opportunity. Why hadn't I thought of that before? Travel meant getting rid of her and resuming my leadership of the group without having to deal with the fallout from a dismissal or rebellion. But I needed to ponder the matter because rather than her helping the bank, I needed her to help me. Now that my superiors had noticed an increase in productivity, I knew that I would have to keep it up or risk losing prestige and end up worse off than before. Sometimes I understand why most of my colleagues don't do very much in order to improve. If they don't succeed, they're called incompetent. If they do succeed, they have to keep improving all the time. A situation guaranteed to bring on an early heart attack. I took the next step very cautiously. It's not a good idea to frighten the person in possession of a secret before she's revealed that secret to us. It's best to pretend to grant her request. I'll bring your request to the attention of my superiors. In fact, I'm having a meeting with them in Barcelona, which is why I called you in. Would it be true to say that our performance has improved since, shall we say, the other employees began getting on better with you? Or, shall we say, began getting on better with themselves? Yes, but encouraged by you, am I wrong? You know perfectly well that you're not. Have you been reading some book on management I don't know about? I don't read that kind of book, but I would like a promise from you that you really will consider my request. I thought of her boyfriend at Scotland Yard. If I made a promise and failed to keep it, would I be the object of some reprisal? Could he have taught her some cutting-edge technology that enables one to achieve impossible results? I'll tell you everything, even if you don't keep your promise, but I can't guarantee that you'll get the same results if you don't practice what I teach. You mean the rejuvenation technique, exactly. Wouldn't it be enough just to know the theory? Possibly. The person who taught me learned it from a few sheets of paper. I was glad she wasn't forcing me to make a decision that went beyond my capabilities or my principles. But I must confess that I had a personal interest in that whole story because I too dreamed of finding a way of recycling my potential. I promised that I'd do what I could. And Athena began to describe the long, esoteric dance she performed in search of the so-called vertex. Or was it axis? I can't quite remember now. As we talked, I tried to set down her mad thoughts in objective terms. An hour proved not to be enough. and so I asked her to come back the following day, and together we would prepare the report to be presented to the bank, or to the bank's board of directors. I try to turn my B's into P's, I'm sorry. At one point in our conversation, she said with a smile, "Don't worry about describing the technique in the same terms we've been using here. I reckon even a bank's board of directors are people like us, made of flesh and bone, and interested in unconventional methods." Athena was completely wrong. In England, tradition always speaks louder than innovation, but why not take a risk as long as it didn't endanger my job? The whole thing seemed absurd to me, but I had to summarize it and put it in a way that everyone could understand it, that was all. Before I presented my paper in Barcelona, I spent the whole morning repeating to myself, my process is producing results, and that's all that matters. I read a few books on the subject and learned that in order to present a new idea with maximum impact, you should structure your talk in an equally provocative way. So the first thing I said to the executives gathered in that luxury hotel were these words of St. Paul's: God hid the most important things from the wise because they cannot understand what is simple. Editor's note: it is impossible to know here whether he is referring to Matthew 11:25. I think thee, O Father, thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. Or from St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 1:27, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. When I said this, the whole audience, who had spent the last 2 days analyzing graphs and statistics, fell silent. It occurred to me that I had almost certainly lost my job, but I carried on. First, because I had researched the subject and was sure of what I was saying and deserved credit for this. Second, because although at certain points I was obliged to omit any mention of Athena's enormous influence on the whole process, I was nevertheless not lying. I have learned that in order to motivate employees nowadays, you need more than just the training provided by our excellent training centers. Each of us contains something within us which is unknown, but which, when it surfaces, is capable of producing miracles. We all work for some reason: to feed our children, to earn money, to support ourselves, to justify our lives, to get a little bit of power. However, there are always tedious stages in that process, and the secret lies in transforming those stages into an encounter with ourselves or with something higher. For example, the search for beauty isn't always associated with anything practical, and yet we still search for it, as if it were the most important thing in the world. Birds learn to sing, but not because it will help them find food, avoid predators, or drive away parasites. Birds sing, according to Darwin, because that is the only way they have of attracting a partner and perpetuating the species. I was interrupted by an executive from Geneva who called for a far more objective presentation. However, to my delight, the Director General asked me to go on. Again, according to Darwin, who wrote a book that changed the course of all humanity, editor's note, The Origin of Species, 1859. We should add that to the book list, actually. I love that book. In which he first posited that human beings evolved from a type of ape, prosimians to be exact. Those who manage to arouse passions are repeating something that has been going on since the days we lived in caves, where rituals for courting a partner were fundamental for the survival and evolution of the human species. Now, what difference is there between the evolution of the human race, that is, of the branch of the bank? None. Both obey the same laws. Only the fittest survive and evolve. At this point, I was obliged to admit that I developed this idea thanks to the spontaneous collaboration of one of my employees, Shireen Khalil. Shireen, who likes to be known as Athena, and brought into the workplace a new kind of emotion, passion, yes, passion, something we never normally consider when discussing loans and spreadsheets. My employees started using magic music, same thing, as a stimulus for dealing more efficiently with their clients. Another executive interrupted, saying that this was an old idea. Supermarkets did the same thing, using piped-in music to encourage their customers to buy more. I'm not saying that we use music in the workplace. People simply started living differently because Shireen or Athena, if you prefer, taught them to dance before facing their daily tasks. I don't know precisely what mechanism this awakens in people. As a manager, I'm only responsible for the results, not for the process. I myself didn't participate in the dancing, but I understand that through dance, they all felt more connected with what they were doing. We were born and brought up with the maxim that time is money. We know exactly what money is, but what does the word time mean? The day is made up of 24 hours and an infinite number of moments. We need to be aware of each of those moments and to make the most of them regardless of whether we're busy doing something or merely contemplating life. If we slow down, everything lasts longer. Of course, that means that washing the dishes might last longer, as might totting up the debits and credits on a balance sheet or checking promissory notes. But why not use that time to think about pleasant things and to feel glad, simply to be alive? The Director General was looking at me in surprise. I was sure he wanted me to explain in detail what I had learned, but some of those present were beginning to grow restless. I understand exactly what you mean, he said. I understand, too, that your employees worked with more enthusiasm because they were able to enjoy one moment in the day when they came into full contact with themselves. And I'd like to compliment you on being flexible enough to allow such unorthodox practices, which are, it must be said, producing excellent results. However, speaking of time, this is a conference and you have only 5 minutes to conclude your presentation. Could you possibly try to list some main points which would allow us to apply these principles in other branches? He was right. This was fine for the employees, but it could prove fatal to my career. So I decided to summarize the points Shireen and I had written together, basing ourselves on personal observation. Shireen, Coelho, and I developed certain points which I would be delighted to discuss with anyone who's interested. Here's the main ones. 1. We all have an unknown ability which will probably remain unknown forever, and yet that ability can become our ally, since it's impossible to measure that ability or give it an economic value. It's never taken seriously. But I'm speaking here to other human beings, and I'm sure you understand what I mean, at least in theory. 2. At my branch, employees have learned to tap into that ability through dance based on a rhythm that comes, I believe, from the desert regions of Asia. However, its place of origin is relevant as long as people can express through their bodies what their souls are trying to say. I realize that the word soul might be misunderstood, so I suggest we use the word intuition instead. And if that word is equally hard to swallow, then let's use the term primary emotions, which sounds more scientific, although in fact it has rather less meaning than the other two words. 3. Before going to work, instead of encouraging my employees to keep fit or aerobics, I get them to dance for at least an hour. This stimulates the body and the mind. They start the day demanding a certain degree of creativity from themselves and channel that accumulated energy into the work at the bank. Customers and employees live in the same world. Reality is nothing but a series of electrical stimuli to the brain. What we think we see is a pulse of energy to a completely dark part of the brain. However, if we get on the same wavelength as other people, we can try to change that reality in some way. And I don't understand. Joy is infectious, as is enthusiasm and love, or indeed sadness, depression, or hatred, things that can be picked up intuitively by customers and other employees. In order to improve performance, we have to create mechanisms that keep these positive stimuli alive. How very esoteric, commented a woman who managed investment funds at a branch in Canada. I slightly lost confidence. I had failed to convince anyone. Nevertheless, I pretended to ignore her remark, and using all my creativity, sought to give my paper a practical conclusion. The bank should earmark a fund to do research into how this infectious state of mind works, and thus notably increase our profits. This seemed a reasonably satisfactory ending, and so I preferred not to use the 2 minutes remaining to me. When I finished the seminar at the end of an exhausting day, the Director General asked me to have supper with him, and he did so in front of all of our other colleagues, as if he were trying to show that he supported everything that I had said. I'd never before had an opportunity to dine with the Director General, and so I tried to make the most of it. I started talking about performance, about spreadsheets, difficulties on the stock exchange, and possible new markets. He interrupted me. He was more interested in knowing more of what I'd learned from Athena. In the end, to my surprise, he turned the conversation to more personal matters. I understood what you meant when during your paper you talked about time. At New Year, when I was still enjoying the holiday season, I decided to go and sit in the garden for a while. I picked up the newspaper from the mailbox, but it contained nothing of any importance, only the things that journalists had decided we should know. Feel involved in, and have an opinion about. I thought of phoning someone at work, but that would be ridiculous since they would all be with their families. I had lunch with my wife, children, and grandchildren, and took a nap, and when I woke up I made a few notes, then realized that it was still only 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had another 3 days of not working. However much I loved being with my family, I started to feel useless. The following day, taking advantage of this free time, I went to have my stomach checked out, and fortunately the tests revealed nothing seriously wrong. I went to the dentist, who said there was nothing wrong with my teeth either. I again had lunch with my wife, children, and grandchildren, took another nap, again woke up at 2 in the afternoon, and realized that I had absolutely nothing on which to focus my attention. I felt uneasy. Shouldn't I be doing something? Well, if I wanted to invent work, that would take such effort. We have projects to develop, light bulbs to change, leaves to sweep, books to put away, computers to file and organize, etc. But how about just facing up to the void? It was then that I remembered something that seemed to me of great importance. I needed to walk to the letterbox, which is less than a mile away from my house, in the country, and post one of the Christmas cards lying forgotten on my desk. And I was surprised. Why did I need to send that card today? Was it really so hard just to stay where I was, doing nothing? A series of thoughts crossed my mind. Friends who worry about things that haven't yet happened, acquaintances who manage to fill every minute of their lives with tasks that seem to me absurd, senseless conversations, long telephone calls, in which nothing of any importance is ever said. I've seen my directors inventing work in order to justify their jobs. Employees who feel afraid because they've been given nothing important to do that day, which might mean that they're no longer useful. My wife who torments herself because her son has got divorced. My son who torments himself because his son got bad marks at school. Our grandson who's terrified because he's making his parents sad, even though we all know that marks aren't that important. I had a long, hard struggle with myself, not to get up from my desk. Gradually, though, the anxiety gave way to contemplation, and I started listening to my soul, or intuition, or primary emotions, whatever you choose to believe in, whatever you call it, that part of me that had been longing to speak to me, but, I got a taste. Oh, but I had always been too busy. In that case, it wasn't a dance, but the complete absence of noise and movement and the silence that brought me into contact with myself. And believe it or not, I learned a great deal about the problems bothering me, even though all those problems had dissolved completely. While I was sitting there, I didn't see God, but I had a clearer understanding of what decisions to make. Before paying the bill, he suggested that I send the employee in question to Dubai, where the bank was opening a new branch, and where the risks were considerable. As a good manager, he knew that I learned all I needed to learn, and now it was merely a question of providing continuity. My employee would make a useful contribution somewhere else. He didn't know this, but he was helping me to keep the promise I'd made. When I returned to London, I immediately told Athena about this invitation, and she accepted at once. She told me she spoke fluent Arabic. I knew this already because of her father. Although since we would mainly be doing deals with foreigners, not Arabs, this would not be essential. I thanked her for her help, but she showed no curiosity about my talk at the conference and merely asked when she could pack her bags. I still don't know whether the story of the boyfriend in Scotland Yard was a fantasy or not. If it were true, I think Athena's murderer would have already been arrested, because I don't believe anything in the newspaper wrote about the crime. I can understand financial engineering. I can even allow myself the luxury of saying that dancing helps my employees to work better. But I will never comprehend how it is that the best police force in the world catches some murderers, but not others. Not that it makes it much difference now. Alright guys, I'm gonna close it off here for today. Because I'm actually a nanny. I know, wouldn't I be? And so I gotta go wake up the kids and get them ready for breakfast. But this was super fun, and I will catch you in the mañana. In the morning. Alright, namaste. I'll see you guys soon.